I was looking at Einat Wilf's resume just now and thinking that it was actually incredibly similar to Ruth Wasserman Lande, who was on our first panel, in that foreign policy advisor to Shimon Peres, gone through Harvard and Cambridge and so on, studying government. You've also been a strategic consultant with McKinsey. Bring all of that experience to the situation to Israel's north, northeast and east. How do you see the geopolitical structure, and is there a way to bring any order to it that will help Israel, or is this simply a lost cause and we're about to see the Iranization, as it were, of our northern borders?
Thank you. I thought you were going to say that I have a resume similar to that of Assad. And I was actually kind of thinking of leading from that, because I want to argue that Assad actually doesn't matter. And that his resume of having been in Britain and speaking good English and being a doctor and being secular, that this matters for absolutely nothing. And I can tell you a discussion that I had 2 or 3 years ago with a very, very senior American public figure. He was in close contact with Bashar al-Assad, and he was very impressed with him. And he kept on arguing, and he met with several Israeli colleagues, he kept on arguing that because Assad is a secularist and truly committed to secularism, he should receive the support of the West. The implication being that secularism means that he shares values with the West and therefore worthy of the West's support. And Shlomo Avineri, a prominent professor here in Israel and a globally prominent professor, told him, you know why Assad is such a committed secularist. He comes from a minority sect considered heretical in Islam. The only way for him to justify, and the only way of his father, to justify the regime, the control of a small minority over Syria, is through a secular regime. One should not read into the secularism the notion of modernity, liberal values, or enlightenment for that matter. And I thought it was a very interesting exchange that said a lot about how much we wanted to believe that because Assad came, studied in the UK, spoke good English, had a beautiful wife, bought on eBay, that all these things made him someone that we could work with and that we could trust. And at the end of the day, it absolutely doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is that he belongs to a small sect, a minority group that rules essentially without legitimacy, but with an iron fist, a country that is an artificial creation. And that is what matters. Because what we're experiencing right now, all over the region, is a once-in-a-century event. And I don't say once in a century as a metaphor. It's literally once in a century. We're seeing here the unraveling of the post-World War I arrangements. Now, most people in the world tend to think of World War II as having shaped the world as we know it today. But in the Middle East, World War I is the war that mattered. It's the war that shaped the modern Middle East more than anything. And out of that, Syria is completely a creation of the post-World War I arrangements, and an artificial creation at that. And what we're seeing right now is authentic forces rising to the top as this 100-year lid is being taken off from the Middle East of the last 100 years. If anything, I would compare it to what happened to Tito's Yugoslavia. You had an iron lid lifted, and then you had very ancient primal forces rising to the top. And that's what we're seeing here. Ethnic forces, tribal forces, religious forces, and all of them bubbling up and playing their role increasingly. And those are the things that matter, not the individual personalities, those very primal, ancient, sectarian, religious, ethnic forces that are now in a way are being set free after being in artificial, iron-fisted arrangements for nearly a century. And this is what's going to define the region, going to define Syria, I think, for a very long time. Now, to draw another parallel on the geopolitics, far from a perfect one, but I'm kind of toying with it, putting aside the terrible 20th century consequences, I think the Middle East is beginning to look more and more like 19th century Europe. A very bloody spring of nations. We forget that the European spring was also very bloody and with many back and forth, not all in one direction of enlightenment and democracy. The rise of ethnic and nationalist forces, and the emergence of mid-sized powers engaged in shifting alliances to shape the region. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the rise of mid-sized powers, whether it's Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia. Egypt would like to be, but has a way to go. And they will be engaged with each other in shifting alliances, and they will be playing parts in various arenas in the region. And Syria is emerging as the prime arena, taking actually from Lebanon, which used to be that for a long time, but emerging as the prime arena where the forces of the Middle East are playing themselves out. And everyone is playing there. Iran assisting the regime to suppress all the forces against. Saudi Arabia, the West to a small degree, Qatar, and many, many other forces are playing in Syria. And because it's an artificial creation, because all these primal forces are rising to the top, this will define the country for a while. And Assad, I will argue, is merely a footnote in all of that. Thank you.
We've talked about Iran, we've talked about Syria. The third member of the axis, if you will, is Hezbollah. How do you see what's happening, the lack of order in Syria, affecting the relationship between Iran and Hezbollah?
Well, obviously, this is inserting a wedge between them, geographically in the most obvious sense. It's also presenting an ally globally in a way that is deeply disturbing to at least the claims of presenting themselves as legitimate resistance movement. The fact that Assad himself and the Alawites have their only choice is butcher or be butchered, and which is why they're behaving as they do. That is clearly not something that helps Hezbollah advance its cause. It's not something that it would like to ally itself with, and the possibility of being surrounded, of being essentially left to its own devices is deeply worrying to Hezbollah. Obviously from the Israeli perspective, and I would argue even from the Lebanese perspective, it's a welcome development, and one that might even, over time, accelerate the process of turning Hezbollah into a Lebanese political movement rather than an Iranian battalion in Lebanon. But that is a more long-term development, clearly, and we're seeing it right now. They are very nervous. We are also nervous on other elements. We're trying to monitor, of course, very closely any movement of weapons from Syria to Hezbollah. This is a disturbing trend in the other direction. But all in all, the descent of Syria into any kind of a chaos, civil war, obviously drives a wedge between Iran and Hezbollah and makes their alliance that much harder.
Mark Weiss from Irish Times. None of the panelists have addressed the question of the timing. It's relatively easy, I think, to agree that Assad is a bad guy and it would be in the interest of Israel and the West that his regime would fall. But the question is, El Yari this morning said that the sooner the better as far as Israel is concerned, because the longer we wait, then the Islamic groups will become stronger. But surely at the moment, it appears to me anyway, there's no unified opposition group that could step in if Assad, for instance, to fall tonight or in the near future. And the result would be chaos, something similar to Lebanon in the 1970s. Paradoxically, maybe it would be better from Israel and the West's point of view to wait until some kind of force can emerge that could take the reins, at least in the interim period, as hopefully Syria moves towards democracy.
Einat, do you want to?
I think we all have to admit that we're much more impotent than we'd like to admit. We like to think about how we act and what we do and the timing, how we choose the good timing. But the truth is that the forces at play here are so much greater that the notion, first of all, the implications that are made, Assad is good, Assad is bad, the downfall is good, the downfall is bad, nobody knows. This is going to be, again, a very long, drawn-out process until all the forces that are bubbling up will play themselves out. I think that Israel itself has limited to no role to play in all of that. Our job is to make sure that we're a bunker and that nothing spills to us. And I would actually say that in this respect, the government, given in general, given everything that's going on in the Arab world, the government in Israel has been very wise to make sure that we attract as little attention as possible in the midst of everything that's been happening in the Arab world, and that has been very wise. I would even discount the possibility that Assad would do something against Israel to save himself, because the saving grace is that leaders don't know that they're about to fall until they fall. So his ability to know that he's falling and take a last step doesn't exist. Leaders realize that they fell only after they fell. Somehow they're never able to see it a moment before it actually happens. So I think at the end of the day, we need to work at containing the situation. We need to open whatever possibilities, Turkey, Jordan, if Israel is considered valuable in that, by all means, to humanitarian aid, refugees. But at the end of the day, these are very deep forces that need to play themselves out. I was in meetings in the French Foreign Ministry where they expressed their endless frustration with the inability to put together an opposition that is of any value. They described the Syrian oppositions as hating each other more than they hate Assad. So again, everyone is drawn into Syria. All the local regional powers, some of the ancient powers, Russia, France, but everyone is merely a shadow of their former imperial selves. And really we have to admit that our ability to do anything here is very limited. The answer is quite simple. Israel has zero public legitimacy in saying things in support of one side or another in the Arab world, especially now less so. Now it seems that as part of the developments, the Arab world is maturing, and efforts by leaders to deflect attention to Israel are proving less and less effective, gladly so. But Israel coming out in support one way or another does not help any side. It is not considered a legitimate voice within the Arab internal kind of various struggles. And I can say, in a bit of irony, I recently had a meeting with a member of the Iranian opposition who asked that Israel come out publicly and loudly in support of the Iranian opposition. And I asked him, would it really help you? Would it not hurt you? Does Israel have a legitimate public voice to support the Iranian opposition? And he was like, they blame us as being Mossad agents anyway, so you might as well publicly support us. But that aside, obviously the notion that we would make a statement and that it would be considered helpful and useful is not part of our experience in the Middle East.